All right. Welcome, everybody. We are here to talk about my favorite piece, which is, of course, the bishop. We're going to talk about why I love the bishop so much, um, various good, bad, and other qualities of the bishop, some bishop classification ideas that I came up with myself. I'm going to, for most of the class here, just have my screen shared on a Lichess study, which I'll then share the link to at the end. So let me go ahead and pull that up here. All right. So let me just introduce why I like the bishop so much. Um, this game by Bobby Fischer is a game that made a big impression on me in terms of um, showing me like the potential of the bishop, why the bishop is so great. So as you can see, Fischer has a bishop and he's playing against Romanov. This is from their candidates match from 1971 when Fischer was like on his like march to the sea toward the world championship. And I actually want to jump ahead a few moves to where it's just the bishop against the knight. The rook's not traded at some point. And uh, and the course of this endgame, which is by the way objectively winning for white, it's already winning. This position is already winning. The course of this endgame sort of illustrates a few characteristics of the bishop, um, which yeah I find useful and interesting. So uh, Taimana plays 97, bishop e8, and I want to point out like the first maybe obvious thing about the bishop, which is that it's vast. It has a vast scope. It's a very long range piece, right? So the bishop is influencing both the king side and the queen side. The knight is doing a bit of that, but the bishop is doing more of it. And also, if the bishop were to like move to another square, as we're going to see on the next move, it will still be doing the same thing, which is not so easy for the knight to do. So notice that when Fischer's bishop moves from e8 to f7, um, it is still influencing both sides of the board. And particularly, it's still controlling the same square, g6, that it was when it was on e8. So it can make a move and keep in touch with the same square, in this case g6, black's pawn on g6, which remains um, under surveillance. And so black's knight remains tied down to it. That's not the case for the knight. If the knight moved, it would no longer keep in touch with that pawn. So the knight is like tied down to the defense of that pawn. The knight is immobilized by having to stay in place in order to defend that pawn. The bishop, not so. The bishop can move around and still be touching that pawn. So that's another nice thing about the bishop. Okay, so Fischer activates his king, and he sort of maneuvers his bishop around a lot, but he eventually gets to um, sort of where he wants to be, which is he wants his bishop here controlling these squares so that the king can't come back here, and that allows his king to advance more. And then the bishop does some more maneuvering, and specifically check out what Fischer does right here. Okay, he wants his bishop on e8, but he wants it on e8 at a moment where it's going to be black's turn once the bishop gets to e8. So, for example, if he were to go like bishop f7 right away, king c6, check, king c7, then it's white's turn here. So instead, he goes like bishop c4, just sort of wasting a move, and then coming back and then going to e8. So he just triangulated. I mean, it doesn't look like a normal triangle, but he triangulated in the sense that the bishop took three moves to get to a location where it could have gotten in just two moves. So the bishop can triangulate. That's a power that the bishop has, which, for example, the knight does not have. So that's another cool thing about the bishop. Now, the reason why he did this triangulation is because now black is in Zugzwang. So black's knight has to stay guarding this pawn. The king has to stay guarding um, this square and this square so that white's king can't come in and take that pawn or advance further. And so,
Quick question.
yeah, go ahead, Lucy.
This might be an incredibly stupid question, but for some reason I've always been under the impression that only kings can do triangulation.
Well, you just saw the bishop, get
Yeah,
connected.
yeah. This is the
Yes,
first time I've ever seen it with another piece, but that's a
right.
thing.
Yeah, like I said, it wasn't like a normal looking triangle, but
Yeah.
it's the same underlying
Same
principle
same
of
concept,
triangulation,
yeah.
where you're sort of getting there in an odd number of moves rather than an even number of moves. You sort of have the choice of which you do.
Okay, so yeah, bishops can do it too. Cool, thanks.
Yeah. So okay, so since black is in Zugzwang, he has to basically move his king and give up this pawn, or he has to move his knight and give up this pawn. So he moves his king and attacks the bishop. Then Fischer just cashes in his bishop for three pawns and wins from there. He was winning the whole time in that bishop versus knight endgame, but um, kind of cool how he transforms that at the end here. So in conclusion, this endgame, made a big impression on me when I first saw it. It was just really striking how Fischer's bishop was just like dominating Taimanov's knight. Now, uh, my favorite number of bishops is two. It is even better than having one bishop is having both bishops. Uh, the two bishops, aka the bishop pair, um, is, an even more powerful and effective um, force in a position than a single bishop. So, however much a single bishop can outstrip a knight, two bishops can often even more outstrip a bishop and a knight, or particularly two knights. So, in this case, this is another game that made a big impression on me, mostly for how the game ended. So, this guy Malakov, Russian grandmaster and also literal nuclear scientist, um, he he basically applies a lot of pressure against a very strong grandmaster, Ukrainian grandmaster Kuzbov, and Black defends, and there's some mutual mistakes. It's not a perfect game, but we'll see at the end just how strong these two bishops are when they work together. Okay, making some progress. Black is defending. Some stuff gets traded off. Some more maneuvering. Black doesn't budge. Black is just waiting. Black is just trying to hold a draw. White is trying to press for a win. Eventually, um, eventually some more trades occur. The position gets even further simplified. In general, these simplifications are favoring the defender. They're making it easier for the defender to defend because he just has fewer liabilities to keep under control. But in this case, he ends up having to give up a piece here. So he gets like one of his knights trapped or something. Yeah, he loses one of his knights, and then it's two bishops against a knight and a pawn. Now, not everybody knows this, but two bishops win against a knight. Objectively speaking, two bishops against a knight is winning, which is really remarkable considering that two knights don't even win against a bare king. So king and two knights against a king is a draw. King and two bishops is a win even against a king and a knight. That's how strong the two bishops are. And again, there's some mutual mistakes here, especially related to the 50 move rule. But White did eventually win this game with two bishops against a knight. Again, that made a big impression on me, just showing how powerful, how well coordinated the two bishops can be. Um, and how they can really just like sort of take over the whole board against the knight, which is like sort of short range, and eventually the knight gets like separated from the king, I believe, is what happens here. And no, it doesn't even get separated. It just black is like in Zugzwang here. He has to like I guess move his king at this point, and I don't even know what's about to happen. I think, gosh, what is about to happen? I need to just turn on the engine. King G6, and then just bishop C3, and then black is literally getting checkmated here. So, okay, so again, very cool demonstration of how the bishops are great when there's two of them as well. Now, returning to that Fischer game against Taimanov, Um, at some point, I also stumbled across this game, and I got an incredible sense of deja vu because I was like, wait, wasn't there another Fischer versus Taimanov game where he had a light squared bishop and a rook against a knight and a rook? Like, am I hallucinating? This is from the same candidates match. Two of the six games in the candidates match, or rather, like two of the three games where Fischer had white, ended in this same light squared bishop against knight. Now, I say light squared bishop because um, that actually, there's even more deja vu to come. So there's another Fischer Taimanov game from the previous year where Fischer has a rook and a light squared bishop against a rook and a knight, and Fischer wins this game too. So there's three games where Fischer is white against Taimanov in a 6 month period, where he ends up with a light squared bishop against the knight and wins. And this is basically the genesis of my classification of the four bishops according to nationality. So,
Is this your villain origin story?
yeah, you could say that. So I've got this four nationalities of the bishops scheme that was sort of inspired by seeing all these Fischer games where he has a light squared bishop against a knight. And we're going to talk about these four nationalities, but I just decided that the white light squared bishop is just Fischer's bishop. That's just the American bishop. And then I assigned some corresponding nationalities to the other three bishops, which we'll talk about, English, French, and Soviet. Um, so not only, guys, are there three Fischer games against Taimanov from 1970, 1971 with the light square bishop against the knight, there's another one of the same endgames from the next one of the next candidates matches against Petrosian. This is game seven of one of Fischer's subsequent candidates matches, his final candidates match against Petrosian. And then there's even a bishop versus knight um, dynamic, a light square bishop versus knight dynamic in the famous game six of the World Championship match itself against Spassky from 72. And I went and looked in my 60 memorable games, Fischer's game collection, and I counted all the times that one of his games with white ends with the light square bishop being the final minor piece on the board. And there's 9 games of the 37 white games in that book where Fischer gets the same game. Pardon me. The first game against Sherwin, the second game against Larson, this one against Rossetto, one against Unzicker, Orich, another one against Petrosian, one against Tall. Some of these are famous games. Some of them are somewhat less well known. But um, yeah, so I hope that you will be inspired by all these examples to think of this as the American bishop, as I do. I feel like my relationship with the white light squared bishop has really strengthened by thinking of it as American. Okay, so let's talk about the other three bishops. Now, black's light squared bishop, I call the French bishop. I call it the French bishop because often in the French defense, this bishop is a bad bishop. So that brings up the concept of bad bishops generally. Um, so a bad bishop is traditionally thought of as a bishop that is blocked by its own pawns, okay, especially the center pawns. So when a bishop is blocked by its own pawns, especially its center pawns, it is often called a bad bishop. And this is an example from a game of mine from last year, Tennessee State Championship, where I was playing white. I'm a French player myself, but in this game, I was actually playing white against the French, and my opponent has a bad bishop, and my opponent also has doubled pawns, and this pawn is isolated. And I don't have any bishops. I just have my knights, which are sort of better at leaping around and maneuvering in a closed position like this. And the bishop really is just sort of running into walls here, and it's very difficult for it to like attack anything in my position. And Surprisingly, white is just objectively winning here. Even with even material, just positionally winning for white. And I did end up winning. I didn't mess anything up from here. And just sort of skimming the course of the game, you can see that black was just sort of very passive. His bishop just sat there. It's literally immobile at the moment. It certainly was never able to make any threats whatsoever against my position. It was completely unable to, contribute to the defense of the dark squares. I sort of just could occupy the dark squares and use them however I wanted. I ended up actually trading off his bad bishop in order to invade further with my king on the dark squares, and then I won a pawn, and then I won the endgame of a pawn. So that's like a classic example of a bad French bishop. However, sometimes the badness of the French bishop can be deceptive. Here's another French position where you might think that this bishop is just as bad as in the previous example. However, check out what happens with this bishop in this game. This is a very old game from the early 19th century. These guys are like the two best players in the world at the time. B5, black sacks the exchange for two pawns, both of white's center pawns, gets his knights out of the way of those center pawns, mobilizes the center pawns, and then suddenly the bishop is like liberated. And the bishop like springs to life, contributes to the attack against white's king, makes the decisive final move of the game, upon which white resigns. So that bad bishop that we saw initially, um, sort of surprisingly and violently became a good bishop. So, uh, there is a sort of potential, a latent potential in the bishop, even in a bad bishop. There is this famous Soviet chess saying, even the worst bishop is better than the best knight. Um, I don't know exactly what the source of that proverb is, but as a bishop fan myself, I often invoke it. Um, uh, there is a book which I read with great enjoyment, which I'm going to include in the recommended reading list, which I'll link to you at the end of the study here. It's called The Secret Life of Bad Bishops by Esben Lund, a Swedish player. I think he's an IM. And he actually calls bad bishops double-edged bishops, just to be less pejorative and to emphasize the fact that even a bad bishop could end up being a good bishop under the right conditions.
I
And
call them squish ups, squish
okay,
bishops.
got it, got it. Well, we'll see whether that catches on, Lucy. So um, in this endgame position, this is a good demonstration of how, like, even the worst bishop, the worst looking bishop, like, how could you get, this bishop looks terrible, right? But somehow it proves better than this knight with the help of some, again, violence by white. Stacking a pawn, stacking another pawn, and then suddenly white is winning. And and again, we see like the long range um, value of the bishop. The bishop is both, restraining black's pass pawn, supporting his own pass pawn. Um, so, keep in mind the sort of double-edged nature of even a seemingly bad bishop. Um, okay, so that's the French bishop. Now, the English bishop is what I call White's dark squared bishop. Why do I call White's dark squared bishop the English bishop? Well, because of two different openings that have an English character involving this bishop. One of them is the so-called English attack in the Sicilian, specifically in the Najdorf. Against the Najdorf, one of the many main lines is this line with bishop e3, where White's dark squared bishop um, comes out first. I mean, first, like before the light squared bishop. And the English attack for a while was like the main line, and it's still very popular. Um, so here's a game by an actual English player, Michael Adams, demonstrating how useful this white dark square bishop is in the English attack specifically. So we get into a position where like white is castle queenside and black, is definitely not going to castle queenside. His king's going to be either in the center or on the opposite side of the board. So that lends the game a sort of whole board character where like there's going to be stuff happening in this lane and in that lane, happening everywhere. That sort of full board type position lends itself well to the long range powers of the bishop. And so we're going to see in this game that White's bishop proves useful again for both attack and defense. So I'm kind of speeding through some of these games, by the way, but again, you'll have the link to this study at the end of the class, and you can take a closer look at any of them, whichever ones interest you. So um, there's some cool stuff with Bishop A7, and then even the final position here, where Black resigns. He resigns because he sees what White's winning move is here. It's sort of a surprising move. It's Bishop C5, just putting the bishop on a hanging square because Black's back rank is weak. If he takes with the bishop or if he takes with the queen and the queens get traded, then again the back rank is weak, rook d8. So, okay, so that's like the English attack, but then there's a sort of even more famous or notorious opening related to the white dark squared bishop, which is the London system. And yet another reason to call White's dark square bishop the English bishop. Um, a lot of people hate facing the London system. Actually, in this game, uh, the same player, same English player, Michael Adams, demonstrates very impressively how to play against the London system. Um, the player playing White is, notorious chess villain Sergei Kuryakin. And so definitely makes us happy to see Adams win a nice game here against Karyakin. But already, like out of the opening, the White's dark square bishop does not look very impressive here, right? Like already, something's gone wrong, maybe like in terms of this bishop as related to the pawn structure. Sort of like that worst case scenario with the French bishop that we saw in my game from the Tennessee Open, where like that bishop was just passive. It was blocked by its own pawns. It couldn't do anything. It had to just sit around and watch while stuff was happening around it. That's kind of what happens in this game. Adams just uh, gets a strong attack going. Karyakin never quite gets like his kingside attack going. The bishop just like stays here doing nothing basically for the rest of the game, and and eventually black just like harvests it. So the fact that White's English bishop was sort of reminiscent of black's French bishop in that other game brings me to the topic of how these bishops are doppelgangers of each other. Okay, White's dark squared bishop, White's English bishop is Black's French bishop. It's just White's version of Black's French bishop in the sense that they are the same queenside bishop. Okay, even though they're on different colors, they sort of have they sort of have a similar role in the family, right? And so, you know, I was sort of probably generally aware of this, but I started to become explicitly aware of this when I read this passage in another great book, Learned from the Legends by Mihail Mara, and he's probably my favorite author, my favorite chess author. Um, his stuff is just like solid gold. So he's talking about Fischer, and he's talking about not just Fischer's fondness for the white light square bishop, but his equivalent fondness for black dark squared bishop. Again, the king's bishop in both cases. So the fact, and he points out further that it's related to which openings Fischer plays. Fischer plays the King's Indian as black, where the black dark squared bishop gets a lot of action. He plays the open Sicilian as white, specifically like the bishop c4 variation, where the white's King's bishop gets a lot of action, right? So it's like just like the English bishop and the French bishop are sort of doppelgangers of each other, the American bishop is the doppelganger of Black's king's bishop. And so, of course, I felt that it was appropriate to call Black's king's bishop the Soviet bishop. I felt that that was like a particularly appropriate doppelganger for the American bishop. So let's talk about the Soviet bishop. So that's the final bishop nationality after English, French, American. We've got Soviet. It's sort of like a, allied powers theme going on with those four nationalities. So let's talk about the Soviet bishop. Uh, does anybody know why, besides the certain geopolitical theme, does anybody know why, in chess terms, I might call Black's dark square bishop the Soviet bishop? Any bright ideas? It
King's
is,
Indian.
well, yeah, but that doesn't really have anything to do with the
Well, I
Soviet
just thought
Union.
it was kind of pioneered by
Right.
Russian players, but okay,
Yeah,
okay.
that's true. That's true. But there's an even more sort of primitive connection, which is the Leningrad variation of the Dutch
Ah,
defense, where that bishop gets fianchetto, just like in the King's Indian. A not so much of an A-list opening as the King's Indian, but the Leningrad Dutch. I want to actually talk about the Leningrad variation of the Dutch. I have experienced a lot of trauma against the Leningrad variation of the Dutch generally, but specifically the Leningrad. Um, you know, this is a game of mine from what year is this? 2021. Uh, this was from a Norm tournament in Charlotte where I was so close to making FIDE Master. This was when I was still a national master, and all I had to do was win this game with white in round eight against a lower rated player in order to break 2300 FIDE in the live rating and become an FM. And I went into this game just like ready to like leave it all on the mat. My opponent played the Leningrad variation of the Dutch. Things went wrong. Black's dark squared bishop ended up like tricking me. There was like some tactic that I blundered where the bishop did like a switchback. Um, yeah, black played bishop h6, hitting my queen. I took this pawn, and then the bishop came back. And now suddenly bad things are happening, and I'm losing. And I lost this game. So that was one traumatic experience against the Leningrad Dutch. Then I had another one at that same Tennessee Open last year. In fact, against the father of that player who I showed you that game against the French. His father is Grandmaster Alex Fishbein, who beat me in the Leningrad Dutch in the final round to deprive me of my fourth state champion title, and instead he got his like third or fourth state champion title again with the Leningrad Dutch. This game was even worse than that last game. I mean, Alex just totally outplayed me. I had no chance. It was just like one player, playing and the other player applauding, basically. I mean, it was horrible. I mean, sort of amusingly, um, he did the same switchback as in that last game against Shamatava. He did the same like bishop h6 and then bishop back to g7 later thing. So, so anyway, the bottom line is that the Leningrad Dutch um, was causing me so much pain that at some point I decided if you can't beat them, join them. And so I decided to become a party member. And and now for the past few months, I've actually been playing the Leningrad Dutch with Black. And just a couple months ago, actually, this is my last tournament game. I played the Dutch in an over-the-board rated tournament game for the first time ever as Black. Oh, it was against a much lower rated player. But I won, so, I'm sort of, you know, redeeming the trauma. And, I'm like turning it into a positive thing. So, um, anyway, that's why Black's Dark Squared Bishop, I call the Soviet Bishop. So those are like the four bishop nationalities. And, and now I want to talk about a few topics related to bishops interacting with each other. rather than just like individual bishops in isolation. So I want to talk about how there's like a sort of zero sum dynamic regarding bishops. Um, and specifically, I want to recount a funny anecdote from my years living in New York City working at the Marshall Chess Club. There were like tons of grandmasters just milling about constantly at the Marshall Chess Club. And one um, contingent that was particularly present there were grandmasters from the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. For some reason, there were just like several Georgian grandmasters who were always there. I played them constantly. Um, Tekalitsi was one of them, Kashishvili, Gelishvili, several Georgian grandmasters, Izoria. Um, and they often like sort of, I mean, they were all friendly with each other. They sometimes kind of like made fun of each other, ribbed each other. And I remember this one time when Kekalitsi was in some playing some game where for absolutely no reason he brought his bishop out and traded it off for a knight, like totally unprompted. It wasn't this position, it was a position like this, where he traded his bishop for a knight and got an awful position. And there was like no, it was a completely like unforced bad decision. He just did it voluntarily. He brought his bishop to g5, traded it off for a knight, got nothing for it, got a bad position, and lost. And and I remember one of the other Georgian grandmasters like observing the post-mortem afterward, and at the moment where Kekalitsi is demonstrating that he did this, one of them simply commented, "Positional maestro, Mikhail Kekalitsi." Like it was just like it was like such a, you know, it was just like such a obviously silly decision to make, just like demonstrating like poor chess culture to make such a decision. And it was just funny to see one grandmaster sort of like mocking another grandmaster in that way. Positional maestro. So now I think of that, I see that action in my students' games all the time. Bringing a bishop out, especially for some reason the queen's bishop, and trading it off for a knight or ending up being induced to trade off the bishop off for a knight. And I always think positional maestro, you know. So I think of it as the positional maestro move. This is just an online game that I played where my opponent uh, demonstrated his positional maestro-ness. And the course of this game, I think, well illustrates the danger of just sort of cavalierly developing your bishop only to trade it off for a knight. Because here I have the two bishops, and he just has the bishop and knight. And I say this to my students a lot, but not everybody realizes that one of the big advantages of the two bishops against not the two bishops is that one of your bishops is unopposed. In this case, Black's dark squared bishop is unopposed. And that bishop is often particularly strong because the other person lacks that bishop. So that's sort of what I mean by the zero sum nature of the bishops, is when you trade off a bishop, it makes the other person's bishop stronger because you don't have that bishop anymore. So it makes it harder for you to influence the dark squares. It makes it hard for white to influence the dark squares here because he doesn't have his dark square bishop and black does. It almost makes it almost makes white like doubly weak on the dark squares because he can't cover them very well and black now, you know, and black can. So that's sort of what happens in this game is that I use my two bishops for evil. I keep them alive. I immediately like undouble my pawns and liquidate that strategic weakness. And then I just apply a lot of pressure for the rest of the game and I mean I think the position is already just losing. The position is already losing for white, positionally, just positionally. Like I end up winning a pawn. I mean, look at what his bishop has been doing for the last like 20 moves, just like shooting blanks, right? While my bishops are both like doing something actual here. And then I cash in some more and then I win. Okay. So again, um, bringing a bishop out. Again, it's often the queen's bishop for some reason that this sort of bad habit occurs. Um, with in the games of my students that I see them often just like they don't know what to do with the queen's bishop, so they just sort of flick it out to this superficially active square, and they end up having to trade it off, and then they don't know why they end up in such a bad position, and it's because they were a positional maestro. That's what it all comes down to. So another example of the same thing, although this is with the king's bishop, is the so-called center fork trick, which is a um, which is sort of like a bad opening line. Um, it's like a variation that can arise from the four knights, where white plays a combination of the four knights and the Italian here. Um, uh, Basically, no strong player plays this variation with white because of this center fork trick. Knight takes e4. Now, knight takes e4, the idea is that if white takes with the knight, then d5 wins the piece back. So sometimes people overreact and give up the bishop instead of giving up the knight. They do it like this. This is another example of sort of positional maestroing here, because white has sort of doubled down on the bad decision. White has not just given up a center pawn, but now white has also given black the two bishops, and all that just for like a kind of spite check here. Black is already winning here, too. Black is literally winning. Um, I mean, if you look in the database, I mean, it's amazing how many people have cho have chosen to do this. I mean, even strong players have chosen. This is a grandmaster. This is like a classical game. This is like a less game or something. I mean, but it's just amazing how many people. I mean, if we look in the Lichess database, there's probably hundreds of games here where white has done this, and this position is literally losing for white. So, um, uh, this is yet, another example of how when you trade off one of your bishops for a knight, it makes the other person's bishop that you traded off, their corresponding bishop, unopposed, therefore often particularly strong. This is that game between Seviano and Hendoko, where black's light square bishop just like white can't really stand up to it. It's making this pin. The pin can't be challenged. The pin can't be neutralized, and um, and black ends up winning. He converts it very well. There's there were no chances for white to escape. White is a very strong player, and black just crushed him. Basically, it was just a bad enough opening that it proved decisive. Okay, so that's one sort of thing I keep in mind in terms of how the bishops relate to each other, the sort of positional maestro dynamic. Another one is the so-called Capablanca rule. Now, the Capablanca rule is a rule related to how you arrange your pawns um, in relation to the opponent's bishop and also in relation to your own bishop. So the Capablanca rule states, now I actually don't know where Capablanca himself said this rule. So I hope it's not like apocryphal that he said this and that it was actually someone else who said this. But supposedly, Capablanca's rule for what to do with your pawns when your opponent has a bishop is that when your opponent has a bishop, you want to put your pawns on the same color as their bishop. Okay. So uh, in this is a game by Steinitz where he demonstrates Capablanca's rule perfectly. He actually puts every single pawn on a dark square, and it has the effect of restricting white's dark square bishop and also restricting white's knight. So he puts his queenside pawns on dark squares, he puts his kingside pawns on dark squares. Every single pawn comes onto a dark square. And that has, like I said, the effect of restricting white's bishop. In this case, it also has the effect of restricting white's knight. And finally, it has the effect of getting out of the way of the unopposed bishop. This is the bishop that white doesn't have. And so that's the bishop that can really rage in this position, black. And so keeping our pawns out of the way of that bishop is very effective. And in the course of the game shows that um, it further demonstrates how Steinitz's unopposed light square bishop proves very strong White's bishop never really gets any action. Steinitz ends up trading it off. Actually, Steinitz ends up even trading off the other bishop too. He even ends up trading off the good bishop, but it's because it leads directly to a winning pawn ending. So, um, yeah, Capablanca's rule of putting your pawns on the color of your opponent's single bishop. I think about that a lot. I think about that in my own games a lot. Um, all right, so I've given you a number of different things related to the bishop um, that I think about and that could prove useful or at least interesting for you to think about. So just to review those things, like I showed you some stuff related to a single bishop against a knight, like this Fischer endgame. I showed you several other examples of Fischer using that light squared bishop um, against a knight or just in general. Um, I introduced my sort of nationality scheme for the bishops in terms of the four countries that they're from. I talked about bad bishops, specifically in the French defense, and how even a seemingly bad bishop can prove to be more like a double-edged bishop that can have some real potential, that can end up being very strong under the right circumstances. Um, and the proverb, even the worst bishop is better than the best knight, related to that. I talked about how the English bishop for white is sort of like the doppelganger of the French bishop, and same thing with the king's bishops. White's American bishop is sort of the doppelganger of black's dark square bishop, the Soviet bishop. Um, I I gave you a new chess term that I'm sure you hadn't heard before, positional maestro, which I hope sticks with you. Um, and finally, talked about the Capablanca rule in terms of putting your pawns on the same color as your opponent's single remaining bishop. I've got at the end of this study a link to all of these books that I referenced. Some of the links are not to the book itself, but to like a chess games collection of the games in the book. There's even a link to a Chessable course instead of a book. Um, all these books are available in print, of course, whatever your preference is. And then I also linked to a few articles that I wrote for the Marshall Spectator, um, which are all related to bishops in some way or another. They're not really topics I touched on in this class, but they are bishop related topics that you may find interesting if you want to do some more of a bishop deep dive on your own. Um, okay, great. So with that, I'm going to unshare and I want to take some questions from you guys. If anybody has any questions um, about any of these topics or anything else about bishops.
I think
Questions?
uh,
Yeah.
I think Fisher said one time that the bishop is worth 3.25
Hmm.
units of material.
Right.
Do you agree with that analysis? Do you think he's under or overestimating it?
You know, he's not the only one. There have been several people over the years who have proposed like a different material count for the bishop than for the knight. And some people say 3.25, some people say 3.5, I mean, personally, I just do a flat three for the bishop and for the knight when I'm making decisions in terms of like material decisions. Um, but, you know, I mean, of course, I do try to judge whether my bishop whether I think it'll prove stronger than a knight if I'm making a decision where I'm keeping a bishop. I mean, I do, I do keep in mind, of course, that like sometimes the bishop can be stronger than a knight, but I don't reflect that in any sort of a material count in the same way that like sometimes a rook is better than a bishop and a knight. Sometimes a rook is worse than a bishop and a knight. I don't try to build that into the material count. I just try to remain aware that sometimes that's the case and try to recognize which scenario I'm in when I'm making a decision related to trading a rook for two pieces. So same thing with a bishop and a knight. I don't have to like sort of make it numerical in order to remain aware of it. in my games. Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. Um, any other questions about bishops or anything else that we talked about here? Lucy, you
So
have
when
some.
you have the bishop there, how hard are you uh, trying to avoid trades with their same colored bishop? Is it the sort of thing where um, you're like, oh, if it gets traded, it gets traded, or are you like, no, you have to take care in order to to be sure that you can keep the bishop pair, and so it's worth having a couple of um, odd moves in order to keep the bishop pair and keep that advantage, as opposed to simply trading off one of them.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. So Mark is asking, like, when I have the two bishops against a bishop and a knight, how, how much do I put myself out in order to avoid letting him trade his remaining bishop for one of my bishops and then simplifying down to just a single bishop against a knight? And the answer is that I do often take some pains to try to keep both of my bishops alive and to prevent trades. Yeah, I often do try to keep both bishops alive just because, as we saw in that Malakhov game, the two bishops working together often can do even more magical things than just a single bishop against the knight. But it's not like I avoid it like the plague either. I mean, as we saw in that Steinitz game, Steinitz ended up trading, like you said, the same color bishops for each other, and then he even traded off White's bad knight at the end too. So I mean, it was all a means to an end, right? I mean, you don't win the game by getting your two bishop merit badge. You win the game by actually checkmating. So like whatever brings you closer to checkmating is ultimately worth it. And it's really about like what's left on the board rather than like what is leaving the board. So yeah, good question, Mark. Um, other questions or thoughts? Did you have a question, Lucy, or no?
Kind of. With the Capablanca rule at the end,
Yeah.
um, I'm just facing a little confusion because a couple of years ago I was introduced to it by a friend on Chess, but um he actually said it was the exact opposite and that you want your pawns on the opposite color of the bishop so that the bishop has nothing to hit. So,
That is not what Capablanca said. I mean, there are
okay.
situations like what you're saying where you would want your pawns to be on the opposite color as the opponent's bishop for safekeeping. But that was
Yeah.
that's not the purpose of Capablanca's rule. The purpose of his rule is to use the pawns to block the other person's bishop. Now, his rule is not like a rule in the sense that it applies in every situation.
Yeah.
There are definitely situations where it doesn't apply. So it's more just like a pattern you could think of
Well, like which
Capablanca's
one
rule.
would you like steer which idea would you lean more toward, if you know what I mean?
Well, I use the Capablanca's rule a lot in my own games, so I would say that I tend to follow Capablanca's
Okay.
rule more often than not.
Cool.
Um, but with any pattern, especially when you've got like instances where the pattern works, but also instances where you would want to do the opposite of the pattern, in any case like that, you would want to just see many examples of the pattern working properly and also see many examples where you would want to do the opposite, where the pattern doesn't work
Hmm.
and you would want to do the opposite. I mean, uh, because ultimately your judgment about whether to apply a certain heuristic or whether not to apply that heuristic, ultimately that decision is going to be like a holistic, intuitive judgment. It's not going to be a formulaic thing where you say, well, Alex said I should apply it 75% of the time. So I've already done it 3 times today, so I better not do it this one time. It's not going to be like that. It's more just going to be
Yeah.
like, this feels more like an example of a Capablanca's rule position instead of this feels more like an example where you don't follow Capablanca's rule
Yeah.
and you put the pawns on the other, column or whatever, So, so ultimately, it's just about seeing a lot of examples and then sort of making your best judgment about
So
it.
in terms of those examples, would I should I like seek them out or should I just look at my own games and go from there?
Good question. Your own games are a great source of examples. a great source of data points for certain patterns, right? So your games are the arena where you yourself can make decisions and must make decisions related to certain heuristics. And then you get the feedback on whether you made those decisions properly or not. You know, feedback not just on the result of the game, but feedback from the engine when you analyze the game with the engine. So definitely your own games are great data points for patterns, but also, yes, seeking out examples from games of other players, seeking out books on certain patterns or chapters of books on certain patterns. And the books that I linked in the study here are all great examples of that. They're all very sort of, well, not the Bobby Fischer game book. That's just a game collection. But the other three books that I linked are great examples of books based around patterns. There's a whole chapter on a certain pattern. There's examples of it working. There's examples of it not working. A lot of good data points for, to put into your brain. So yeah, you can seek out examples from books or just from, trawling the open ocean for examples.
Yeah.
And you can yeah, generate new examples from your own games as well. Yeah, totally.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else here, guys, before we sign off? Um, okay. Great. Well, thanks to everybody for joining. This has been like our second group class. Both have gone quite well. And so yeah, appreciate you guys being with me for this class, and I'll keep you posted on the next one. So I'm gonna stop recording here, but thanks to everybody.